What I'm constantly sharing with people is that I am a curator because I think and move like an artist. And I think a lot of really amazing curators are like that. I love neon. I love plasma. I love thinking about the technical components. And I'm very aware of honoring the people that have taken the time to be very good at that. But for me personally, I also like the term luminous phenomena. So much of this is immaterial. Like, it's not something you can physically hold. We can talk about how the physicality of the glass is formed, but much of light is so rooted in a bodily experience.
Neon lights, I'm baffled. Pick it apart like samples. Give me all I can handle. Light me up like a candle. I'm taming lightning. Percy got that lightning. Plasma in my veins.
This episode of Taming Lightning is sponsored by the Corning Museum of Glass. Home to the world's most comprehensive collection of glass, the Corning Museum of Glass is the perfect excuse to take a trip to the Finger Lakes. Come and explore 3,500 years of glass masterpieces from around the world. Witness the cutting edge of modern glass art from some of the biggest names in the game. And spectate masterclass artists in live, narrated glassblowing demonstrations. And if you're looking for a way into the glassmaking world, head to the studio for a make-your-own glass experience. It's a great affordable way to see if glassmaking is for you. And no matter what brings you in, the Corning Museum of Glass will help you see glass in a whole new light. Learn more today and plan your trip at CMoG.org. That's CMoG.org. Now back to the podcast. Hello, Lightning Tamers. Percy here. This is episode number 64. In today's podcast, I'm excited to welcome Rïse Peacock, an artist, curator, and educator with over a decade of experience in the educational and nonprofit art sectors, and is currently the first curatorial fellow of Postwar and contemporary glass at the Corning Museum of Glass. Rïse approaches curating, teaching, and art making from an interdisciplinary perspective, with a specific focus on queer histories, material culture, and luminous phenomena. They have curated notable exhibitions such as Big Mood and the Women Create Biennial in Jamestown, New York. Today we'll dive into Rïse's curatorial work, their artistic journey, and their fascination with light-based art, including the significance of Geyser tubes at CMoG's collection. Welcome to the podcast, Rïse Peacock.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Yeah, this has been an interesting residency that have had here at Corning. Mm-hmm. And I just wanted to bring you onto the podcast because of your interests in light and get your perspective. Part of the Taming Lightning has always been to focus on the people because the knowledge comes from knowing the people that are there. Mm-hmm. It has been able to grow that network. And I'm sure that you yourself have been, throughout your experiences, show and have understood the power of a network and a community.
Absolutely. Yeah. I don't think I would be where I am at today if I didn't have a network or a community. And I definitely find that within the luminous phenomena community. There are a number of folks who are in fact willing to share, you being one of them. And I feel so grateful and excited to be a part of a community where folks really want to share their knowledge. I think that for me, that's very much rooted in the spirit of grassroots collectivism and also activism. Mm-hmm. So, both of those things get me quite excited.
Yeah. And when I'm looking at people in different positions, oftentimes, and I'm going to say this for everyone, mm-hmm. You go to a website or you meet someone and you hear their title and you're like, oh, what's a curatorial fellow? And what does it mean to be part of like a post-war contemporary glass? Like, or even was a director of the arts? Mm-hmm. Like, what does that job mean? But in your case, we're going to be talking about being a curatorial fellow mm-hmm. and what is involved here. So could you kind of explain what that role is and what you do at the Corning Museum of Glass?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I first want to note that I appreciate this question so much because I think for decades, there's been so much lore around how people find a job or what a role actually is and what is the day-to-day work. And I feel very passionate about dismantling some of that lore and dismantling the culture of gatekeeping that goes around finding jobs. We live in an era where more and more people need to work. And so I appreciate the transparency. So a curatorial fellow can be different depending on the institution that is hiring that person. It's typically a termed position. So mine will be 3 years. So we are now in the year 2024, and my term will be up in 2027.
Okay.
And so museums, galleries often bring on curatorial fellows to assist with researching something very specific or working on a very particular project. So you'll hear some folks who've had curatorial fellowships and they were brought on specifically for working on publications. My role at the Corning Museum of Glass, at being the curatorial fellow of Postwar and contemporary glass, assumes the role of being the right hand of the contemporary curator, Tammy Landis, of Postwar and contemporary glass. So I research and I work on collection management. Collection management is a very broad term. It can mean a number of different things depending on the day. And so that could mean help cataloging objects that haven't been viewed in quite a while. It could mean assessing objects or works in the collection that need a little more research. Or, one of the amazing things about museums is that oftentimes they keep very detailed object records. And so I help keep those up to date. And I also help with, various writing projects. So anytime you acquire a piece into an institution's collection, there oftentimes has to be a series of paperwork that's completed. And so a lot of my day-to-day work is rooted in writing and thinking about how to record the life of these objects in a very ethical and in transparent way. And writing reports that kind of sets up the next person for success. So 20 years down the road, someone can look at my object record and see how we were thinking about it at this time, but maybe that needs to evolve and change. And you have to be open to that. You can never, I never go into my work assuming I'm a master of something. I'm only working through the tools that I have at my disposal at the time that I have them. So it's likely that even 10 years from now, I'm going to listen to this podcast and be like, oh, I think about that completely differently now.
Yeah, that's one of the amazing things about having a record and document is that you can return to it and say, okay, this is something I can use to express to whomever is listening. Is like, yeah, this is the process. It's always learning something.
Exactly. And so a really exciting component that I also get to work on as the curatorial fellow is exhibition development. And that doesn't mean I get to come up with my own exhibition. When I get my big girl curator job, I'll be able to do that one day. But I get to have a significant role in developing the exhibitions that we are planning. And that's actually an incredible honor to be a part of, mostly because I'm really excited about the vision that Tammy Landis has for the Postwar and contemporary collection. I can't work with people that I don't like. I can't work with people when their values don't align with mine. Maybe that's highly problematic. I don't really know. I don't really care. But I really value accessibility, transparency, and I really value thinking critically about the narratives that we've been told because they've been so hyper-exclusive. And in many ways, Tammy is someone who's hyper-aware of that. And so I feel really grateful to be working with her and to have the opportunity to learn from her as well.
Yeah, to say that is like the only way that could be problematic is if it has ever stopped you from achieving the goal that is beneficial for you and everyone. If it hasn't, it's not even close to being problematic.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that. I think sometimes I realize how stubborn I come across when I'm speaking and when I'm writing on social media. And like the secret, everyone who's listening, is that I'm actually a sensitive little snowflake. I cry every day. Fun fact.
Yeah. That's interesting to hear about what your position is as a curator, because if someone's listening to this and they're coming from an art background,
Mm-hmm.
or they're just coming from a familiarity with art,
Mm-hmm.
which is most people, they think of a curator as someone who puts on displays and exhibitions as a majority of what they do.
Mm-hmm.
So I do appreciate that we're able to kind of enhance this understanding, similar in the ways I was able to have that conversation with, other conservators. So you got head conservators in different departments, and just dialing in what is that position. And so, when you do all these different things, you're helping develop and research, and you're correcting and looking over collections. What do you say this position contributes to the overall mission of the museum? Like, how does that fit into the museum's mission? Yeah,
sure. I mean, I love this question because I actually really love the mission of the Corning Museum of Glass, and the short synopsis, the short version of the mission is we inspire people to see glass in a new light. So for me, what has always stood out to me about that mission statement is that it includes light in the language. And I think that, when you work at an institution, you're working in an institution, and that can be very cumbersome sometimes, and it can also be very enlightening, for lack of a better word. But, you have so many tools and resources at your disposal. And so for me, I feel when it comes to the mission, I have this responsibility to be a leader in my field. And that's different than being a master. I don't want to be a master. I think that's very problematic language that I'm not at all interested in subscribing to. But I do think a lot about what it means to be a leader. And for me, a good leader listens critically to their community and thinks about what it means to be at a specific table. We'll call the table the Corning Museum of Glass. And what it means to advocate for the people you represent by being there. And so the day-to-day work that I do at the Corning Museum of Glass and how it aligns with the mission would be, I'd have to say, I work really hard to advocate for artists and to, I am an artist. I came from a making background. And I think sometimes when you get into an institution that is so large, sometimes that voice can be snuffed out. And so I'm constantly working towards making sure that the artist's voice is centered. And, there are situations where sometimes the artist is no longer around. Yeah. And so how do you go about that in an ethical and generative way, right? And so it's conceptual, right? Get people to see glass in a new light, get people to hear different perspectives, learn about different voices across the spectrum of glass and glass making. But, I identify as being neurodivergent. And so that means that sometimes I take things really literally. And the fact that light is included in the mission is so exciting to me because it's hyper specific and something that I think we need to really hone in on. Because here's the thing, no matter what, when you're working with glass, you're inherently working with light. And I think that's really, really essential to always remember.
Yeah. You can't really work with glass without light. It's all there.
Yeah. It's always there, even in its absence. Air quotes. You can't see my air quotes. Even in its absence, it is there. So.
During this residency, we got a chance to check out some things in the collection. One of those things is Geyser tubes, and we got just able to examine them. And I snuck in with a little spark coil under guidance and permission, but we got to see them light up, which is something that I don't think had been done yet since that has been acquired, and it's only a few of them. Could you help us explain what Geyser tubes are?
Sure.
And sort of their historical significance.
Yeah, I can absolutely do that. Before we get into the historical info, I just want to give a little contextual information on like what it means to have objects like Geissler tubes, which are considered historical objects at a museum. And so, yes, you and I did have lots of fun illuminating them. I did get to illuminate them also when Casey Lees had visited the Corning Museum of Glass. And so anytime you have an object that comes into a museum, it is accessioned. It is evaluated and it is accessioned. And depending on how it is accessioned can mean a number of things. And so long story short, the Geissler tubes that you and I had the opportunity to look at and illuminated were categorized as exhibitry, meaning that it basically allowed us to illuminate them. If they had been accessioned and cataloged in another particular way, we would not have been able to illuminate them. And so I think it's really essential to point that out. And the reason I want to point that out is because the core curator who brought the Geissler tubes in. His name is Marvin Boltz, and he was our former curator of science. I don't know if that's his official title. I should actually look into that. But he was like the curator of science and innovations. And, you know, I don't know Marv personally, but I have had the privilege of hearing him speak about the things that he's excited by, and the fact that he was adamant on accessioning these as exhibitry so that people could experience them.
Hey, Percy here. Sorry about that. We had a little technical issue with the recording during our interview, but the gist of what was being said by Rïse was that Marv had acquired the Geyser tubes into the collection for the Corning Museum of Glass, and that accessioning, that is to record that in part of the collection, was to put it as an exhibitry item, meaning that it could be pulled and viewable by the public. And I want to say that I really appreciate that move by Marv, and I thank Rïse for explaining that to us, because in my experience with working with places that have collections of specific items, for example, many of Paul Side's pieces, oftentimes the work, like Paul's, is in a condition where they don't want to pull it out because they never know when the last time that work is going to light up, especially since the main issue, if you listen to the episode with a conversation on conservation, that with Paul Side's work, they don't really know how to rebuild that transformer, that power supply. It's a custom-made power supply for Paul's work. And so when it comes to conservation, you want to retain as much of the original machinations as possible. And often can be very challenging to convince ethically to trade out a different power source, even if someone makes something that works very much the same. And so for me, whenever I go and try to look at pieces like that or like others, or look in the collections of specific things, what often is that there's not really a satisfactory documentation of the work. And oftentimes what is written about the work to go with that imagery of the collection is very short and very non-helpful and non-inspiring. So I really do appreciate the opportunity to be able to light these up and take a look at them and then be inspired to write and propose a future residency for research where I can actually help them enhance that collection's data by using other tools. So I really thank you for sharing that with me, Rïse. So moving forward, could you tell us a little bit about the historical relevance of Geyser tubes?
So the historical relevance of Geissler tubes is that they were invented by an individual named Heinrich Geissler around 1857. There's some contestant to that, but for this talk, we'll say 1857. And he was a glassblower and also a physicist. And so scientists use Geissler tubes. They produced them until about the middle of the 20th century, and they used them to explore electricity, magnetism, and spectroscopy. But they were also used as like party favors. Like, you have to think, in our digital era, we're so connected to our phones and the internet that we don't think about how there were like whole groups of families that just like didn't have electricity. That was like a whole phenomena, right? Yeah. And so people were using the Geissler tubes to showcase electricity. And variations of the Geissler tubes led to the discovery of the electron and then eventually neon light. So that is their little background.
Nice. And when we're working with these Geyser tubes, how would they relate to your curatorial work and artistic practice?
Sure. I mean, the answer to both of those questions is very broad in that, as I said earlier, when you're working with glass, you're inherently working with light. And so my interest in them, both as an artist and as a curator, is just like it's the origin story of a lot of what we are talking about, sort of. I mean, like luminous phenomena goes back like eons, but as far as like containing it in a glass container, a sealed glass container, they're the precursor for that. And so, as an artist, the answer is like, as both an artist and a curator, it's a fairly boring answer in that like, I just really like, I'm into luminous phenomena, right? Yep. And I actually came across the Geissler tubes by happenstance at the museum. I was like looking for a different object in the storage area, and I came across the Geissler tubes and was like, holy smokes, what are these? And then I started asking around, and it turns out like they were very well cared for. They were very well stored. And our collections manager, I believe, I think it was our collections manager. Yeah, his name's Warren Bunn. He was like, oh yeah, we've had these around for quite a while, and this is how they came to the institution. And so I thoroughly believe that part of our visitor base here at the Corning Museum of Glass is actually interested in innovation. When you ask a visitor out in the galleries, they're not going to use that term, but they're very curious about how things are made and how things work. And so, we get to do what's called a masterpiece in a minute. And so I just kind of like followed my gut and decided to feature them for a social media post called Masterpiece in a Minute. And it did surprisingly well, although it wasn't that surprising to me. Like it's this really gorgeous phenomena. They make noise, they light up, like they're perfect. They're a spectacle in a lot of ways. And so it really excited a lot of people. And from there, a simple social media post connected me to a couple of other folks in the luminous phenomena community. There were a couple folks that had, reservations and were eager to share their opinion of me, opinion of the situation, which they are entitled to. But ultimately, my goal with that was to just really open the door and let people know that those are here and that they are meant to be viewed and experienced. And I would not sit here and say that I know everything about them because I don't. That would be unfair. There are plenty of people who know much more than me, but I think a lot of the time my role in being here is letting folks know what is here and drawing connections. So if any of you are listening and you're interested, sign up, like apply for a research residency. Like, let's look at these things together. I want to hear from you. I want to hear what your thoughts are. I'm not trying to keep them from people.
I'll be first in line for that.
Yeah, please do. I learned so much from you in our session. Like you had mentioned that you think some of them were pumped with, was it nitrogen?
Nitrogen or CO2.
Yeah.
Just whatever would have been the easiest to capture at that time.
Yeah, and that's information I'm not going to know. Like I learned so much from other artists. So it was really valuable. Our time together was very valuable.
Yeah, it'd be great to come back and have some specialized tools to really analyze the light and see what was actually in there.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that brings us into talking about your artistic background. What you do for work is inseparable from your own practice. So I'm curious, how's your journey as an artist and maker, particularly in glass? And I think you have done some light-based work as well. shape your current perspective.
Right.
So give us a little bit of background of your practice in art, and then where those sort of meet with your perspective as a curator.
Yeah, I really appreciate this question because you're one of the few people who have linked my identity as an artist with my curating. A lot of people really want to keep those as separate entities, and I think that's bullshit. I don't know if we're allowed to swear on this, but I think what I'm constantly sharing with people is that I am a curator because I think and move like an artist, and I think a lot of really amazing curators are like that. Artists are curious, artists are critical thinkers, and they're the first to often ask, what if? And they're also, artists embrace the lessons that they learn from failure. We're not afraid to fail. We're not afraid to think about the generative information that can come out of failure. And I think, the term failure can be a really abrasive word for some people. I'm not sitting here claiming that we should devalue skill. That's not at all what I'm saying. I think skill is incredibly important. But much like a scientist, you have to work through open questions, and you have to be able to answer to those questions. And so for me, curating and my artist practice, they go hand in hand. I tell people all the time that I actually kind of came to curating through the back door. If you would have told me in my early 20s that I was going to be working at an institution as a curator, I would have laughed at you. That was not at all part of the plan. Yeah. But, curating happened because I saw a lack of representation within my community. There's a lot of positive things to say about the class community. There's also a lot of critical things to say about the class community. And that is femme-bodied people, queer people, BIPOC people are still very much fighting for the right to be present and to be fully embodied in those spaces. I very rarely feel safe in a hot shop. I don't feel welcome 90% of the time. And I actually have a lot of privilege that allows me access. Yeah. And so for me, curating was a tool to kind of give voice to those who have not been seen or recognized in the traditional narrative that we've been told. And so the exhibition that you mentioned earlier, Big Mood, was actually... It was a virtual exhibition with the Stay Home Gallery in Paris, Tennessee, and it was at the height of the pandemic. And so I used that opportunity to, it featured 13 non-binary and femme-identifying international artists thinking about materiality through the lens of bodily autonomy. Mostly, and the right to take up and claim space. And so, yeah, the short answer to that is I'm an artist first, and I'm a curator because I'm an artist.
Yeah, I had a conversation with I had a friend come in as part of the residency as my assistant. And we talk about how sometimes in the arts, art and craft are separated. They're not separated in the same way that one's curatorial and artistic understandings are not separate. Yeah, definitely not. I think you have to be an incredibly creative thinker to be a critical curator, and because of the fact that I identify and am so passionate about being an artist, that means I also center and advocate for the artist's voice when I'm working on a curatorial project, especially in a material community like glass. One of the positive things that I love so much about the glass community is that it is very communal based, right? You can't do any of this individually. You have to rely on other people, and you have to be able to know how to communicate effectively. And I think that's very different than a lot of the artistic practices that we often see. All right. Let's look into talking about luminous phenomena. So what draws you to luminous phenomena in your work? And how do you split a relationship between light, material, and history in both your art and curation?
Sure. That's a really great question. And I feel like there's multiple answers, and I'm going to try really hard not to ramble, but also that's just what I do. So as far as the exploration between light, material, and history, I'm going to state something that is probably a little bit unpopular, and that is like there is skill and that is to be valued. And with that skill is the responsibility to do research. And you have to be aware of what came before you, right?
Yeah.
Like it's kind of like, it is like that corny thing that Kamala Harris said, where she's like, you live in context. She's kind of right. Like, right? Like we do live in context. Art is not made in a vacuum unless, technically.
Even if it's made in a vacuum,
even if it's made in a vacuum, it's not thought of in a vacuum, right? And so for me, I love neon, I love plasma, I love thinking about the technical components. And I'm very aware of honoring the people that have taken the time to be very good at that. And I think there's something to be said of that. But for me personally, I also like to think of the reason why I use the term luminous phenomena is because so much of this is immaterial. Right? Like it's not something you can physically hold. We can talk about how the physicality of the glass is formed, but much of light is so rooted in a bodily experience.
Yeah.
And for me, that's why the term phenomena is so fitting.
That's awesome because like you said, it needs a body, it needs a vessel.
Yeah.
In order to be contained and shown and shared.
Absolutely. And this is like personal, and I don't mind sharing, but so much of my daily life is centered around my relationship to light. And I don't think that's individual to me. I think we all experience light in very intimate and personal ways. But I mentioned earlier, I identify as neurodivergent. I'm dyslexic, I'm photosensitive, I get debilitating migraines, and I have since the time I was like 8 years old. And so much of my physical daily life is centered around how I will be experiencing light. I wear like rose-colored glasses, which sometimes folks are like, oh, Rïse and their rose-colored glasses. But what they don't know is that I wear these for a reason. They help me read, they help me write, they help me feel more grounded in a space that is often riddled with fluorescent light. And so light is a very physical experience for me. And I think because of how I've had to be very attuned to that, you start to notice yourself noticing, right? Like that's that Alan Capro art happening thing, like notice yourself noticing. And so it's always been inherent in a lot of ways. If you ask my mom, I've always been able to perceive color at a very high frequency. I love color. I love mixing color. My tonal range and my ability to physically mix it has always been fairly advanced. And I know that sounds like a brag. It kind of is, to be completely honest. But I think, light is so inherent to so much of what we do as artists. Even painters. Yeah. Painters are working with light. And so I think there's something to be said of like really honing in on what is foundational. And I think light is extremely foundational to a human experience.
Yeah, it's not just in working with light. You're working in light. Every where you're at and what you're using to make and move in this world requires that light.
Absolutely. Yep.
So I was curious, what type of things do you use in your work or your practice that ties into light?
Yeah. So, glass, obviously. But when I was studying at the Tyler School of Art with Jessica Jane Julius, we had a lot of conversations over there's like a performative element to my work. My work isn't necessarily like a physical object that lives forever. It is very much like an embodied, ephemeral experience. And so a material that I love that is very glassy, I work a lot with cellophane. So like weaving and folding cellophane to become, fairly large scale. I call them sculptures. In my mind, they're very object rooted, but they're impermanent in the sense that they're not going to withhold the test of time. But, I think that kind of is this poetic layer to how light in itself is also very ephemeral. It doesn't it's very much like based on time. How we experience our day is very much an ephemeral experience. The sun rises and the sun sets. And then through the evening, we see a varying amount of like different shades because of light. And so, glassy materials that are not glass, cellophane, mylar, anything reflective. My best friend Karen Donnellan and I joke about how we're kind of magpies in the sense that like we just like anything reflective,
Make your nest out of it.
Exactly. And so sometimes I'll just, if I'm in a phase of where I'm doing like material explorations and something catches my eye, I'll often pick it up and pin it to a wall and just kind of sit and look at it and reflect on it and find language. And from there,
reflect.
Reflect. Thinking about, I'll think about the various language associated with the experience that I'm having and then try to find an abundance of those materials and then recreate it. And I actually think an artist who does this really effectively is Carla Black. She's more of a painter and a sculptor. She wouldn't, I don't think we would really talk about her in the context of glass. But I think her installations are really inspiring in that they're using powders and cellophanes to work with the space and to manipulate light in a really effective way.
Yeah, one of the most important things that I try to emphasize is that while the focus is on things that produce light, like neon and things like, gas discharge tubes or plasma sculptures and lamps, that it is to broaden your luminous vocabulary through multiple materials, which is why sometimes I have a problem or a challenge with using interdisciplinary as a term to describe, because it's there. To me, there's no such thing as interdisciplinary. This is the use of what's provided in the world or what you can manipulate into the world. But that's just my thing.
No, I really respect that. And I hear where you're coming from. I think for me, in an ideal world, the term interdisciplinary wouldn't exist. I find myself in spaces like institutions that really want to categorize things.
Yeah.
And so for me, the term interdisciplinary helps me kind of mitigate some of that, right?
Yeah.
It's all about kind of navigating the spaces you're within to like cause some good trouble, you know? And I have to say, it was, Sarah Blood, who's the professor of luminous phenomena at Alfred University, who really expanded my approach to thinking about materiality in that way. I remember taking my first neon class with her, and I was super dorky, and I went to her and I was like, I want to make like a neon carousel. And she was like, no. And she's like, I want you to think about this expansively. And so, she kind of beat my ass a little, and I love her for it, because it really got me out of what I thought objects should be, right? And what happens when
please tell me you still made a neon carousel, but you used the principles of so-called interdisciplinary and multi-material to do so.
I didn't, but I did weird experimentations with like graffiti around campus and neon, which, I was a younger maker then, so that I wouldn't necessarily consider them my best works. But it's interesting to think about incorporating like neon in space with a something like graffiti that was never really quote unquote meant to be there, but then you're like drawing attention to it, right?
Yeah.
But no, really, I have to give credit where credit's due. It really was Sarah, who is so committed to like neon in a really beautiful way, and also really interested in thinking about how we think about light expansively, and we think about light as the physical object.
So continuing on to finish up our last two questions here.
Yeah.
And then we're looking at your curatorial perspective, and then looking directly at light work. So from a curatorial standpoint, how do you approach exhibiting light-based works, and what are the unique challenges or considerations with presenting these types of works?
I think this is another twofold answer, because there's like the role I have at the Corning Museum of Glass in a very specific institution, and then there's the role I have outside of the walls of the institutions. And believe me when I tell you, I'm constantly trying to mesh the two. Like, I try really hard to actually bring my full self to work, especially as a queer identifying person, because I think it's important that people just get over it, right? Like, so like, yes. And, working at CMoG, the part of the mission includes preserving objects, right? And so when things are not on view, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's because people don't want neon here. It's that a big part of what we do is to keep that object safe and to keep it preserved. And if we are going to put it on view, we do it in a way that isn't going to harm the object. And so there are an abundance of things that go into that. Making sure that, when visitors get excited and they want to touch, that impetus doesn't potentially harm a historical object. We're also thinking about light decay. So how sunlight can erode physical objects and components of that. And we're also thinking about humidity levels. And so all of these are factors that go into whether or not it is safe to put something on view, because part of the mission includes preserving the object, right? And so, I think folks at CMoG are really excited and ready to have more light-based works on view.
It's about time.
I agree. And what is exciting is that I feel so supported by a numerous amount of colleagues. We're seeing that with the build of we're going to have a neon studio at the studio. And so I think especially when that starts moving and grooving, we're going to see a bigger desire to start putting that kind of work on view. But like all things, it requires a conversation with a lot of people to make sure that we do this at the utmost professional level. And that also means that we're likely going to have to contract people to come in and teach us, because we don't know a lot about a lot of things. We have a certain amount of knowledge, but we want to do it well. And so that means likely bringing in other folks to share their expertise with us and to make sure that we're doing it at the highest level. Outside of here, I have to say, I am often called upon to share a critical dialogue or voice about light-based works. I wouldn't consider myself the most skilled practitioner, but I know a lot of people who are, and I like making those connections. I like sharing knowledge. I like making sure that there are people who are in conversation with each other, and I want to share that network. And so I've done some work with the organization She Bends. I've led various panel discussions. I've written a little bit about Luminous works in my independent sort of life, separate from the institution. And, oftentimes I find, and I don't know why this pattern has happened, and it does not bother me at all. I quite like it. I'm not often called upon for technical expertise. And I think that's mostly because, like I said, I'm not a technical expert, but I think about light in a very poetic and conceptual way. And I often, particularly when working with She Bends, I'm thinking about this as a queered material. Neon in particular has been historically marginalized for decades. There are some people who still don't think it's an art form, as you said. And so I find that my knowledge in queer history and queering materials often lends itself to expanding that dialogue and absolutely situating light-based works as an art form.
Sadly, art is one of those things that doesn't have an accepted definition.
Sure.
And it's hard for people to categorize it. But in all things, art and what is considered art is entirely dependent on who calls it art.
Exactly. And who's had a seat at the table and for how long.
Yep.
And that's exactly what I mean. Like, I know what it means to be the person that I am sitting at the table, having the conversations that I'm having, particularly at CMoG. And there are days where that feels like there's a lot of pressure because I can't speak on behalf of everyone.
Mm-hmm.
I have a certain set of privileges that I'm aware of that allowed me to enter through the door. And so how do you have good trouble? How do you say the hard thing out loud? And I take that very seriously. I approach that. You'll hear me in other interviews. Like, I approach that with a very warranted seriousness, and I meet people like you and throughout the community and people at CMoG who are totally down and supportive. And then sometimes there's the occasional person who finds it to be very combative. But ultimately, I just really want to make sure that more people have access.
Thank you for sharing that. My last question here from my list here is about merging art and curation. Do you merge those two things? And how do you balance the creative and analytical sides of the disciplines as you work at CMoG?
I absolutely do merge them. And with that comes an ebb and flow. And so the way I was making and creating 3 years ago compared to now is different. And that's okay. And that's going to happen to all of us in our lives. Like, things are going to ebb and flow. So there's going to be a period of time where I'm going to have more access to make more object-rooted things. And then there's going to be ebbs and flows where it's my writing practice that kind of is at the forefront. And so I find myself in a moment of having my day job, which is working at the Corning Museum of Glass, which I love. But with the kind of role I have, that means I don't have the kind of space that I once had to make objects in the way that I'm used to. And so, like I said earlier, I am a curator because I am an artist. So for me, the practice never stops. It just adjusts depending on the environment. And so right now, I'm thinking a lot about social practice and ephemera, like paper ephemera, and what it means to be working with an archive. I have a project that I'm thinking of that incorporates like zine culture. Like, what would it be to be like, what would it look like to make a zine that becomes a physical object and representative of something ephemeral like light, right? And how do you make that relevant to our contemporary era that is so rooted in like the internet and cloud-based systems? How do you get something interested in a physical object like a zine? And how can you incorporate that with technology? And so, I think for me right now, my art practice is rooted in a social practice, in that it's heavy on writing, thinking about zines, and thinking about flat-based works too. I just had the privilege of taking a class with Sylvia Levinson at the studio, and we worked a lot with like photo emulsion and flat glass. So thinking about practices that may not be as labor-intensive as I was once used to, and making things that are feasible and economical within the time that I have. So you just evolve. You evolve to the conditions that you're in.
Do you believe that the work that you do as a curator is seen by the public?
Me personally? Or
just not you personally, but the work that you do as part of this system. Are people able to see that?
Not
that there is work that comes behind the things that are set up for them to view and see and are available? Not
yet. I don't think that's necessarily publicly available yet, and I think that's part of that is part of what lends to this kind of lore around curators kind of being untouchable or on higher ground. But I'm really interested in dismantling that. And I think more and more curators, conservators, and museum professionals are interested in that. They're facing the music of, we can't operate as a museum in a post-pandemic world like we once did, right? Like we exist to serve the public. And for me, what that means is really dismantling the lore around what these jobs are and what they entail and how you get one. You know, more and more museums are doing really amazing interpretive strategies, like allowing space for their conservators to evaluate an object on the floor and letting the public watch that and allowing space for questions. You know, I think more curators are becoming more open to having conversations like you and I, where we're kind of exposing like the day-to-day work. And I don't think it's been like that in the past. I think for some reason there's been this conception around like curators being like all-knowing and hard to get a hold of. And I think it's stale. And I don't think I'm the only one who thinks that way. So I'm very excited to be a part of this next wave of like how we gonna be in the world together, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, because the reason I asked that was because you know, this conversation, this discussion, this interview is helping us see what this role is, see where it's in the museums and spaces like it that help us see what's on display, and knows that there is a system behind it and there's people behind it that are helping contribute to that accessibility.
Yeah, thank you.
And so I'm going to close out with a last question here. You mentioned both Sarah Blood and you mentioned Sheep Ends. I've yet to have an interview with Meryl Padaky from Sheep Ends. What do you think are some interesting things, and I also leave this to the listeners here, that I should ask Meryl when I schedule with her for a podcast? It's due.
Yeah, no, she's a legend. Like, I have to say, like, I have such a crush on Meryl, and I'm not afraid to publicly announce it. And that's mostly because I think what she's doing is so unbelievably radical. And in a lot of ways, like, on a personal note, like, Meryl's kind of like the punk rock older sister that I never had and I always dreamed of. And she's been incredibly foundational to the way that I do what I do. And it was, you know, Meryl, Sarah Blood, and also Karen Donnellan, who isn't necessarily a neon artist, but definitely thinks of light in a very poetic way. All three of them have had a really critical impact in supporting me. You know, it was Meryl at the height of the pandemic who contacted me and was like, hey, like, I really like your voice on social media, which is kind of abrasive, to be completely honest. But like, it was her that was like, I see what you're doing and I really value what you're doing. And for anyone to be in a position of power and go out of their way to do something like that is really radical. Like, opening the door for someone else is one of the most radical things someone can do. And so if I were sitting, talking and interviewing Meryl for something like this, I would really try to root the questions in giving her the opportunity to voice why she does what she does and the reasons behind it. You know, I think what Sheep Ends is really excellent at is sharing knowledge, much like you do with this podcast. And so I would really root the questions in trying to situate an opportunity for her to advocate for why she does what she does. That makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, of course.
This has been an enlightening conversation, pun intended. I'm seeing the mission on the wall right now. And thank you for taking the time from your schedule to set this up so we can have this conversation and get it recorded and out there for people.
Thank you. Right back at you. I've been a fan of the podcast for a while, and it feels like an incredible honor to be here and to be connected to this community that you've cultivated. It's really amazing, and I hope that more people feel inspired to do it in their own way and to keep sharing the knowledge and to keep making and to keep asking the hard questions and, you know, causing a little bit of good trouble. Good trouble is always good. Thanks, Percy.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for listening to the Taming Lightning podcast. Music credits to the following artists in order of appearance: Retro by One, Taming Lightning Theme by Trav B. Ryan, Good to Go by One, and Walking by Roz Hobb. I hope you enjoyed the podcast, and I appreciate you, Rïse, for taking the time to be on the podcast. There's a lot going on with this residency, but I really appreciate the support and company during my time there. I was inspired to hear about the ways that the curatorial and conservation staff work together behind the scenes to make something as simple as viewing the Geyser tubes possible. And I hope to return in 2026 for a residency in research where I can improve the information about the collection and perhaps encourage a unique educational display of luminous glass, which has been sorely missing from the Corning Museum display. So let's keep in touch. I'd like to thank the Pittsburgh Glass Center for supporting me as a place of research and inspiration, the Plasma Art Alliance, and the Facebook group Neon and Plasma Art for Beginners, where I have an access to a well of knowledge and connects me to some amazing and supportive people. Please support Taming Lightning by subscribing to the newsletter on www.taminglightning.net or follow on Instagram @taminglightning. Other options for support are one-time donations through Ko-fi, spelled ko-fi.com/taminglightning, or you can join me on Patreon for additional perks and benefits. I'll have links provided in the show notes, so feel free to share, comment, and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.